Everyone, welcome to Introduction to Building Applications with Windows Azure. My name's Dave Lemfers. I'm a Senior Program Manager with Windows Azure. And first of all, I want to thank you for taking time out of your lunch to attend this session. I know the timing wasn't perfect, and a lot of folks either didn't get a chance to eat or kind of hurriedly came back from the mess hall. So again, I really thank you for taking the time to attend the session. So overview of today's session, first we're going to talk a little bit about Windows Azure for application developers. We're going to talk about building an application from scratch in Visual Studio 2010 B2. We're going to review the application that we build, and then we're going to wrap up with some cursory notes and some sessions that I think you should attend, or you'll definitely get value out of attending. So what are the three main session objectives today? Well, the first one is to understand the major parts of Windows Azure. And the main part of that objective is to make sure that you feel comfortable with all the different aspects as you go about building applications for Windows Azure. The second one is that you experience building an application from scratch. So the objective in this session is that you can walk away, download all the tools, feel confident that you can go and build an application from scratch exactly as we've done it today. And then the final part is that as you move on from PDC and you start approaching building applications in Windows Azure, you don't only feel comfortable doing what we did in the session, but also extending from that and trying some other new things. And so again, the sessions that I point out at the end of this session are really about how do you take what I show you today and then start building upon it. So again, to level set this session, it's really about what are the basic things that you need to know to start building an application from scratch. So there's three main areas when we think about building applications in Windows Azure that you need to be cognizant of. The first part is developing. And so the first thing you'll do is you'll download the SDK, you'll install it on your local machine, and that'll do two things. It'll install a range of Visual Studio templates, both for VB and C#, and those templates enable you to build cloud service projects. The second thing it does is it installs a simulation environment on your development machine that simulates running your service in the cloud. So the great thing about that is that you don't have to actually go and build and publish out to the cloud if you want to try building applications in Windows Azure. You can actually run it on your local machine in the simulation environment, and you can experience what it's like to build a hosted service or write against the storage service. And we'll look at that during the demo as well. Then there's the portal. So once we've done all our development on the local machine, we've tested it, we've simulated it, we feel comfortable that it's ready to go to the cloud, we can use the portal to deploy that package. And so we call that publishing locally and then deploying on the cloud. And then from there, you can actually run your application and start your service. And then from there as well, you can manage and maintain that service. And again, we will look at that during the demo. And then the final phase, which is the phase when you're in the cloud, is the run phase. And so your service is either going to be running as a hosted service in the hosted service part of Windows Azure, or you're going to be communicating with the storage service to persist and store data. So those are kind of the two main areas when you think about the run environment. So let's start talking a little bit in more detail about what you'll encounter when you start building these applications. So the first concept you'll encounter is the concept of a role. And in essence, what a role is your code. That's your ASP.NET, your pages, your service artifacts, all the things that you're usually familiar with when you're building an application in Visual Studio. And then there's the configuration of that service. So it's things like how many instances should I run? What are my certificate configurations? How do I actually want to configure my endpoints? Do I want to use HTTP over port 80? Or maybe I want to use another port other than port 80? Or do I want to use HTTPS? So that's where you're telling the environment, here's the configuration of my application, and here are the artifacts that constitute that application, and together those things form a role. So once we have a role and we've deployed that role, what's happening when it's running inside Windows Azure? So the first thing is, as I described, we're able to tell Windows Azure something about my application. So one of the configurations is I can say how many instances of this application do I want run. And so then what will happen is so for example, if I say I want 2 instances, we will deploy 2 instances of your role. And then what we'll do is we'll configure it, or we'll wire it up to a load balancer, and then we'll publish that through a URL. So in this example, it's yourapp.cloudapp.net. And so then when users are hitting that endpoint, we automatically load balance across your instances. So as long as you have more than one instance, sorry, you've got the ability that if one of those instances fails, we will automatically redirect traffic to the second instance. So it really supports that high availability. And you just get that with Windows Azure, which is fantastic if you're building services that you want to stay available. So if we think about the types of roles that you will encounter, certainly when you're building an application from scratch, you're going to have two choices. You can either build a web role or a worker role. Now, each of these roles have certain attributes. So they've got things like endpoints, public endpoints that can be accessed via the internet. And they've got internal endpoints, which are a communication mechanism where you can have instances talk to each other. The key differentiator, though, when you're building these applications is the consideration of what type of role you're building. So if we look at the web role, this is analogous to our traditional ASP.NET web solution. So a WCF service, an ASMX service, an ASP.NET web application. And so when you're thinking to yourself, what kind of application am I building, and it sounds like that, you're going to be targeting the web role. If you're building something that's more analogous to a service or a Windows service, something that's going to be executing in the background, running through a set of work items in maybe a loop or in kind of a scheduled manner, then that's when you're going to be considering something like a worker role. And again, in our demo, we will actually build both a web and a worker role, and we'll see the differences between both of those. But again, this is more as we start to approach it from a mind point of view and say, okay, if I'm building a particular type of application, which one should I use when I see it in the tools? So when we think about storage, storage is a separate system inside Windows Azure. So what we were talking about with roles, web roles, worker roles, is the hosted service. Your services, your web pages, those kind of things. When we talk about storage, we start with the concept of an account. So an account for me, for example, will be David, at windowsazure.com, or something that actually identifies my space of objects. And then off an account, the account then leads into these different services. So there's three main services inside storage. You've got the queue, and that's your message-based service where you can put small messages onto the queue and use that as a communication mechanism. So perhaps you might use that as a way to communicate between your web role and your worker role. You can actually persist messages on the queue, and you can write them and you can read them. The blob is for those large binary objects, and they're traditionally things like photos, documents, movies, anything of that nature. And so you can store those in the blob service. And then the tables are for that structured data, so key value pair style data that you want to store inside your cloud application. So those are kind of the three main areas, and they all link to account. You create your account first, and then you can build off those three services. For our demo today, we're going to focus on blobs and queues. And the reason we're going to focus on those is those are the two services that you will find most useful at the very start of your development experience. So as you start building applications, and it's a very powerful pattern that we see a lot with customer applications, is the use of blobs and queues, and then the use of web and worker roles communicating between the two. So if we want to think of blobs, if we drill into the next layer, we have this concept of containers first of all. And the idea of a container is, for example, you're going to store pictures. So I'll create a container called pictures. And then from that container, I'm going to store blobs. So I might have photo 1, photo 2, photo 3, and each of those are going to be in my picture container. And that's actually how I reference it. So we'll see when we build the demo that when I actually get a reference to the blob that I've stored, it'll actually be in the format of HTTP, whack, whack, my account URL information, whack the container, and then whack in the blob. And I can actually then access that based on the permission that I set for it from the cloud. So if we think about queues, again, very similar pattern. We have this first level object, which is the actual queue. And then the next level is the messages. So the messages, I have the ability to store data inside those messages. So in this one, for example, I've just got some simple text, body 1, body 2, body 3, which constitute 3 separate messages. And those 3 messages are living or have been stored inside my thumbnail jobs queue. And again, this is a very powerful pattern that we see a lot in the distributed cloud-based applications that we've worked with, certainly over the last 2 years, where an application through some kind of front end or some kind of, interface process will update something in a blob or a table, and it'll create a message on the queue in the form of a work item. And then a worker role can be polling that queue, and when new messages appear, can pop that off the queue, process it, and then remove it from the queue. So earlier on, I explained that when you download the SDK, we install two main areas or two main aspects onto your machine. The first one being the VS Tools templates, and the second one was the local simulation environment. So there's two key things when we install that. The first one is they kind of get packaged up as the simulation environment, but we've got the development fabric and the development storage. So the development fabric is simulating what it's like to host your services, your web roles and your worker roles. And then the development storage is simulating the cloud storage service. So that's where you're going to store your blobs, your queues, and your table data. And so the great thing about this simulation environment is it's full fidelity with the cloud. So you don't need to, and we certainly experience it as well in the product team. We'll build something, and we'll want to make sure it just runs perfectly. All the code works, it's performant, it can handle the aspects of multiple instances, accessing data and processing data. So by being able to simulate it on our local machine and debug it there and fix all the bugs, we're able to make sure that it's ready for the cloud and then simply push that up. So again, one of the key takeaways for this audience as you start building those applications the first time is you can do everything you need to do locally before you're ready to package and deploy that up to the cloud. So the next stage is, we've got a mental model of what's happening inside the hosted service and the storage service. We understand what worker and web roles are. We understand what behaviors they have and why we might use them in our application. We understand what storage service offers in terms of blobs, queues, and tables, and why we might use that in our application. And we've used the local SDK through Visual Studio to build our application, test it locally, and now we're ready to publish it. So what you'll do is you'll actually publish it on your local machine in Visual Studio, and then you'll upload those packages to the portal. And then from the portal, that's when you'll actually provision your space, you'll run your application or your service, and now it's available to the cloud or to the public. And so we'll use the portal to do that in our demo today. And certainly you'll use that when you'll start building your applications. There's also the ability to use a service management API, and that's actually covered in quite a level of detail in a session later on at PDC. So I've got a pointer to that at the end of this deck. So let's look at the Hello Cloud application that we're going to be building. So the first thing is that the first thing I want to call out is that this is a very powerful and common pattern that we see in applications built on Windows Azure. So the first thing is if we look at the kind of left to right what's happening, and I'll call out the major parts. So the first one is we're using a web role, and you'll notice that we're using multiple instances of the web role, and we're doing that for availability. We've got a worker role, and again, multiple instances of the worker role. And then we've got a queue which are joining those two things. So the way that the web role is going to communicate to the worker role in terms of I've got work for you to do is going to be through the queue. And the queue messages are going to be pointing to information that's stored in the blob. So again, what's going to happen is the web role is going to store something in the blob, put a bit of information on the queue to say that that's what it's done, and then the worker role is going to pick that up. But the key thing is to get that pattern in your head. We use web roles, worker roles, queues in between, and they're using the blob as that kind of persistence layer. So let's go through and talk about the web role. So the format of this session is I'm just going to break these down into small chunks. So we're going to start with the web role. We're going to do a very basic, kind of Hello Cloud demonstration. And the purpose of this is that we can actually exercise all the big bits. So we're going to use Visual Studio. We're going to build our application. We're going to publish it. They're going to see it running in the cloud. And then we can go back and start extending that solution. It's very typical of what we do when we start building our application. We'll start with something small, and we'll start incrementally adding to it. So in this one, we're going to simply have the web role. It's automatically configured behind the load balancer. We're going to have multiple instances. And we're not using storage, and we're not using any worker roles at this stage. That will come later in the demo. So the first thing we're going to do is create a very basic ASP.NET page. We're going to have a text box, a button, and a label. can kind of guess where I'm going with this. We'll update the text box, we'll hit the button, it's going to put that information in the label. So the first step we're going to do is create a cloud service project. We're going to add a web role to that project. We're going to write some code, inside Visual Studio. Then we're going to publish. We're going to run that locally. We're going to publish it and then deploy it to the cloud. See what that experience is creating our account. And then we'll actually run it from the cloud and see what that works like. So the first thing is Visual Studio 2010. And again, you can use Visual Studio 2008. My preference is to use 2010, and certainly there's a whole bunch of features that are worthwhile. When certainly building Windows Azure projects, but just using it as a developer. So the first thing we're going to do is create a new account. So we'll go new project, cloud service. So when we install the SDK, as I said, a whole bunch of templates get installed into Visual Studio. We're going to build some a C# project. It's going to have Windows Azure Cloud Service. I'm going to call this Hello Cloud. Hit OK. And now the next step is, as part of this wizard or as part of this project wizard, it's going to say, what kind of role do you want to add as your first role? So we get a whole bunch of choices here. And again, I really encourage everyone after this session and certainly after PDC to go through and explore each of those roles and what they do and what benefits they have for your solution. But the first one is the ASP.NET web role, and that's what we're going to use in our demo today. The next stage is I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this Hello Web. Hit OK. And so what happens next is Visual Studio creates my solution at the top. It adds two projects. The first one is my actual cloud service project. And it has all the details about my cloud service. So the first thing you'll see is there's a folder for roles. It's added my Hello World web role to it. And then it's got some configuration and definition files. And then the next thing it's done is added the actual ASP.NET web project. And in there, I can actually start adding my artifacts and adding my code. So let's go ahead and do that. Double click on default. Go to the designer. And so the first thing we need to do is go drop a text box inside our page. And so again, the other thing you'll notice as I go through this is I'm using the same skills and experience I had before I started using the cloud service projects. So everything I used to do inside Visual Studio, building ASP.NET applications, is what I'm doing today. And you would have noticed from the keynote that that's something that's common amongst most of the partners and customers. They had an ASP.NET solution, and they simply ported it across. So the next thing I want to do is add a button. We'll add a label that we'll set. And then when we click the button, we want to take whatever we've typed into the text box and set the label to that. So let me scroll that up there. So let's go label 1, text equal text box 1.text. Nice and simple. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to just hit F5, like we're used to doing. What's going to happen, though, is because it's a cloud service project and we've got the SDK installed, it's immediately going to deploy that to the actual local development environment. And it's going to simulate that as if it was running in the cloud. So the one thing that we want to do is we want to go to the Solution Explorer and we want to double-click on the Hello World project underneath our cloud service project. And what you'll see is straight away it brings up the configuration UI. And in here, I can actually set things. For example, I can add connection strings, configuration elements, or I can define how many instances I want for this service. So again, we were talking about high availability. So let's make sure that we're running two instances of our service. So we'll go ahead and run that. So what's happening now? And let's go to our fabric. So what's happening now is the fabric is operating as if the cloud would actually take our project. And it's doing the step that it would have done when we published and deployed the project. And so what Visual Studio is doing now is it's actually packaging up our solution. It's deploying it into the fabric. It's taking the service information that we said. So it said, hey, I want 2 instances of this. So it's built out the 2 instances, and now it's deployed our application to it. So if we look under here, we can actually see that these are the 2 instances running. This is what it would be like if we actually remotely connected to those instances and saw what they were running, as if they were in our web farm or something like that. And so if we now go and look at the solution, we'll notice it's running on the local host. So in our project, we have it set to using port 80. Because port 80 is reserved on the local machine, the local simulation environment will just increment that by 1, so we can actually run through here. So let's go say, hello PDC, click on the button, and straight away updates the label. So we've already come a long way. We've built an ASP.NET solution, we've packaged it, we've deployed it locally on the simulation environment, we've run multiple instances, we've interrogated that inside the UI and seen that that's actually what it's done. And so now we're ready to do that last step, which is publish it up to the cloud.
How you can see that you run 2 instances?
Sorry?
How can you see that you're running 2 instances?
So you can actually see here that we've got 2 instances running, 0 and 1. So if we had only had 1 instance in our configuration, we would only had 1 node underneath that project.
Do you know which instance you're in right now?
I can get to that at the end of the session. If you want to keep your questions till the end, I'll race through this and then we can go through that. So the next stage we're going to do is go back to our solution, which we're happy is running. And the next thing we're going to do is right-click on the cloud service project, and we're going to get a couple of options. The first one is the publish option. So when we click publish, Visual Studio is going to use the SDK and a bunch of tools inside the SDK to package up our project. And so remember, in the slide before, we talked about the fact that we have code in configuration. So it's going to package all of that up into a package file. It's going to take our configuration and it's going to add that as a file as well. It's going to then put us into the portal so we can upload it. So if we look at what the publish step produces, we have the package file, which has all our code and stuff that we added into it, and it's got the configuration file. Now, we don't have to do anything about that. It just happens. And then we just have to point the portal to this location. So let's go in here and we'll sign in. So when you create an account, you'll get access to the Windows Azure portal and you'll have a project name. So I've got David Lemby 1. And once I click into that, I've got nothing set up right now. So I need to go and create myself a hosted service where I can actually deploy my application. So it's really easy. Click on New Service. I get the option to either create a storage account or a hosted service account. For our web role, we're going to create a hosted service. So I click on that. And I'll call this Hello Cloud PDC. And so the next thing is, it's going to ask me, what do I want as the public service name for this? So I can use something that's going to be unique. And I can check if it's available in case someone else might have that. And the next step is it's asking, where do you want me to deploy your application in terms of our data centers? So we have this great thing which is called an affinity group. So I'm going to go down there and use that. And essentially what an affinity group is I create this logical group or this deployment label. And every time I want to deploy something as part of this application, the Hello World application, I simply select that. Without having to actually decide which region I want to deploy into, it'll deploy my application as close to each other as possible based on that group. So let's go in and say, let's create a new affinity group. We'll call this PDC Hello Cloud. And we're going to say, I actually want all of this to be deployed into North Central US. So now what happens is the portal is going to take all that information. It's going to go create a space for me. It's going to say, OK, I'm now aware that Dave has this Hello Cloud PDC application. And I'm going to create some slots for him. The first one it's going to create is the production slot. And now I'm able to actually deploy my application into that slot. But right now, nothing is provisioned. It's simply made a kind of if you want to call it a pointer to the fact that I may use this, but no actual resources have been committed at this stage. So now I'm going to go click deploy. It's going to ask me for 2 files, the configuration file and the package file. So we have these here. Let's go and copy and paste. So we're going to select first the package file. Then we're going to select the configuration file. We'll call this PDC, and we'll hit deploy. So what's going to happen at this point, two main things are going to happen. The first one is we'll see a processing step as it uploads my package from my local machine to the cloud. And it stores that in my account. And what it'll do then is it'll say, Dave against the production slot has uploaded his package, and now it's ready for when he's ready to run that. And you can see here it's actually deploying the package right now. So while that's cooking, let's quickly go back to our slide deck and we can kind of have a look at what we can expect to see. So what's going to happen first is we're going to enter this stage which is stopped. And that's when we've what we call allocated the project. The package has been uploaded to the portal. It knows some information about what I need. It's allocated that project. But you'll notice that there's a bunch of buttons that appear, upgrade, run, configure, and delete. So what we want to then do when we want to put the service online, or we want to bring it into service, is we click run. And you'll notice it's at the stopped phase. And once we hit run, it'll then start enabling the deployment. So it's now putting it into a run phase. The next thing is the portal will actually start initializing the project. So it'll go out and create the instances. It'll deploy the application into those instances and start bringing it up. It'll then enter a busy stage. And what's happening when busy is we've allocated and we've initialized those instances. And now we're doing the last testing to make sure it's wired up to the load balancer. And you can access it via that public endpoint, and it's ready to go. At that point, we put all the instance counts into ready. And now when you click on the URL, it'll be up and served. So now, to save us time, and at the end of this, we'll go back to our demo that we built. I created one before, so let's go and have a look at on that one. So back to our laptop. So right now, I hit run on my laptop, and you can see it's going through the steps of enabling the deployment and the things that we just looked at. So let's go and look at one that was done earlier. So we'll sign out of here. I'm going to sign in with the second account that I have. So let's go. So click here. Click on our project that we created. And we can see here now that this is in the ready state. So this is the project that I, essentially based on our demo that I deployed earlier. And it's actually in the ready state where I could go and suspend it, or I can upgrade it, or I can configure it. And if I go and click at that website URL, it's now bringing it up. So that's going straight from the cloud. If you guys wanted to hit it now, you could. And we're going to say, yay, our first app. Click that, and it's done. So, we've built our first cloud app. We've gone through the whole experience. We've built it locally using Visual Studio. We've run it locally. We've packaged it on the machine. We've published it to the cloud. We've gone through the phase of initializing and then running our service, and now it's running. And there's multiple instances behind a load balancer serving up that traffic. So let's go back. So what's next? Again, we've now gone through the major stages of building our application, publishing our first one, and we're kind of 20 minutes in. So you can see straight away that it's very powerful and also very easy to build your cloud-based applications using the same skills and experience you have with the tools that we deliver with the SDK, and you're up and running very quickly. So the next stage, though, we want to kind of build this solution out. So what we want to do is we want to start adding some blobs and queue data to our application, make it a little bit more full-featured. So now what's happening is we have our web role, which we just built. And what we're going to do is we're going to upload a blob. It's just going to be a bit of data that we type in. So remember the text box. Let's go and create a blob of that information. And then what we're going to do is create a queue item based on that URL. So the blob will create a URL that we can access, and we're going to store that in a message in the queue. Now down the track, remember I said we're going to have a worker role that's going to pick up that queue item and then process that blob. So that's going to happen after we do this stage. The main three steps we're going to do is we're going to configure our storage account. So remember I said that storage has that concept of an account. So in our code, we need to be able to create an object that represents that. The second thing we're going to do is upload the blob. And the blob data or the blob content is going to be whatever's in that text box. And then the next thing we're going to do is in-queue a message onto the queue And then that's going to be the next stage of our demo. So let's go ahead and do that. Close that down. Close that. I'm not going to use the portal from this point on. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to change the code that we wrote that was simply updating that label. So let's go into our default page, go behind here. Let's get rid of that. So inside the button click, the first thing we need to do is we need to add a reference to the storage account. So let me walk you through what's happening here as we talk about how we start building storage capabilities into our cloud applications. The first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a cloud storage account object, and that's a representation of my actual account. The second thing I'm doing is I'm referencing this storage connection string. So already we know we need to go off and create that somewhere in our application, and I'll show you where we do that. And the second thing you'll see is that we've actually got some IntelliSense issues. The reason is we have to actually add a reference to the storage client library, which is a .NET library that we provide, which enables you to access the storage service. So let's go do that first of all. Let's go put in our using statements. So the first one we'll do is Windows Azure, and then storage client. So Windows Azure encapsulates a bunch of objects which are general to Windows Azure that are required by the storage client library. And then the storage client library namespace actually has the specific storage client objects that we need. So we've done that. Let's go to our solution now. Go back into the configuration settings that we saw before. We go into this settings area, and we add a new setting, and we'll call it storage connection string. The type is a connection string. It's not just a normal string, which tells Visual Studio to load this UI. So here, I'm using the local development storage again, because that's how I want to test it, make sure it's all right, bulletproof before I upload it. But when I'm ready to upload it, I can simply enter my live storage credentials and then publish it to the cloud. So let's go ahead and do that. Then we'll go back into our... So again, the first thing we've done, we've created our cloud storage account. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to add the blob. So again, I've got, for the sake of simplicity, I've got these code snippets. At the end of this session, you'll be able to get access not only to my slide deck, but you'll also get access to the project, and you'll get the code snippets that you need. So you'll be able to use those code snippets in Visual Studio to just add this code. This code is also available throughout the SDK samples. So don't feel freaked out if you see a lot of the code and you're thinking, where am I going to get that from? And secondly, it looks like a lot of code, but I've wrapped it in a lot of comments to make sure that you've got enough insight into what's happening under the covers. So again, the actual steps, though, are actually quite few. So let's quickly go through these. The first thing, blob client. So we need to create an object that enables us to go and talk to the blob system. And so we call that the client object. It acts as a kind of mediation for me to go talk to that service. The next thing is, remember we talked about containers. So before we can create blobs, we need to create containers for those blobs. So we create ourselves a container, and we use the client to do that. And I'm going to call my container Hello Cloud. The next step is a little bit of defensive programming. So I'm saying, hey, if this container doesn't exist, I need to create it before I can start adding blobs to it. So the first thing it does is it actually creates that container. And then remember I said that you can actually secure a container based on who you want to have access to it. So you can make it public or private. So in this one, I'm making it public. Anyone can have a look at my blobs. And then finally, I set the permissions of the public permissions on my container. The next thing is I just create a discrete object, which is my blob object. I go ahead and get a blob reference from my container for that blob object. And you'll notice that I've got to give it some kind of identifier. So I'm just creating a GUID. That's the reason why I'm using a GUID in this example. And now I've got the blob. The blob is living inside the container. The container is created under my storage account. And I'm ready to upload some data to it. So I'm simply taking the text information out, and I'm going to upload it there. So now we've done the first step. We've actually taken this information, created a container and a blob, and we've uploaded that data. The next thing we need to do is we need to put some information on the queue so that with the worker role that we go and create can actually go and find that. So again, same pattern. Let's go add our queue message, and we'll see a couple of things happen here. Now you'll notice that we use the same pattern, the client. This time we're using a queue client. So it's exactly the same as our blob. We go and get ourselves a queue client. We go and create our queue. So this one's going to be called Hello Cloud Queue. We're going to create it if it doesn't exist the first time around. And then we're going to create ourselves a message, which is the message that's going to contain our information. And the message we want to capture is this URI to the blob. Where are you storing this blob? And then we're going to add that message to our queue. And the last step is let's go and update our label so that it's got the blob URI details. So now we've added the storage connection information so that the client library knows where to connect. It's connecting to our development storage locally. We've added in code that's uploading the blob, based on the text that we enter into our text box, and we're putting a queue item onto the queue. The last stage we need to do is, if any changes happen, any configuration changes happen for our application, we want to make sure that this piece of code is aware of that. And the way we do that is we go into our web role class. So every web role we create has this web role class associated with it. And we'll notice that there's an onStart event when this web role actually starts up. And we're going to go in here and add some code. And again, this bit of code is a little bit unwieldy, but again, don't freak out. You'll see it a lot in the samples. You'll see it in the code snippets that I'll provide after this session. And essentially what it's doing is it's creating a wire up to say, if any configuration settings ever change in this app, can you please go let the cloud, that part of my code know about it so it can adjust. And so let's go and add the appropriate reference to that. Let's go and build that, make sure there's no errors, which there aren't. And now let's go off and run that. So what's happening? Exactly as we expect, we have the development fabric. It's gone off and deployed our application, multiple instances. But the difference this time is that we actually have to use the storage accounts as well. So there's this great tool that I certainly use, which is from Cerebrata, which is the Cloud Storage Studio. And this enables me to just use a really nice UI to look inside my storage. So I've got my local. I just simply go in here and connect to my development storage, which is running on my local machine. It's added it already in there. And I can go and interrogate which queues and containers and things that I've created, tables and stuff like that. So let's go in here and say, hello, PDC folks. We'll go off and save that. And you'll notice that it's given me this reference here. So this is the complete URL reference that I can use to go and have a look at my blob. So the great thing is you upload pictures, text, media, whatever it is, when it's stored in the blob, and if you set the permissions to public, you can simply take that URI and use it in your applications. So you could perhaps save pictures that are assets in your web app, and you can simply access those directly. You don't need to go through any client code or anything to do that, which is just fantastic. So let's go off and create a whole bunch of these, and you'll notice that it's kind of incrementing that GUID. And what's happening is it's uploading this blob, and it's creating the queue item. So let's go have a look at what's happening under the covers. Let's go first have a look at what containers. So it's created our Hello Cloud container. Let's open that up. It's created all our blobs. And let's go look inside one of these blobs. It's going to download it. It's going to say, hey, I don't understand what type you're downloading. So we're going to open up in Notepad. Yeah, there's the content. And the other thing we're going to do is let's go have a look at this queue. So there's all the queue items. So what do we expect to see inside that queue item if we open it up? Well, there you go. It's the actual URL reference to the blob that it created. And so now our worker role knows how to go in there and get that information. So let's go and close that down. And let's switch back. So now, we've built our first web application in Windows Azure. We've published it to the portal. We've accessed it from the cloud. We've come back. We've added storage capability in the way of writing blobs and adding some queue information, and tested it locally again, made sure it's working, it's writing to the local development storage. And we've all done that in kind of 35, 40 minutes. So the last stage of our application is to go build that worker role. And so what's the worker role going to do? The worker role is going to go and dequeue that message. It's going to take that message and say, what blob do I need to go and update? It's going to go update that blob, and then it's going to go update some information inside the blob to change it from what we typed into something like this is processed. And then it's going to take the message off the queue so that any other instances of the worker role that come in aren't going to process that again. So again, let's add the worker role. Let's dequeue the next message, update the blob reference inside that message, and then delete the message from the queue so it just doesn't keep getting processed. So again, back to... Okay, so what are the steps we're going to do? First step, let's go into here and let's add that worker role. So let's right-click, add, new worker role project. We could call this hello worker. And what we'll notice here is that we have a different, so we don't have the on start that the web role had, we've actually got run. So it's very much, as I said, analogous to a Windows service in that it's going to now execute this run, and it's just going to start doing some bit of work. So let's go through and say, in our while loop, let's go process a message. So let's go off there, build our... And so again, I've got a code snippet just to help us along, but we'll quickly go through that as well. And so what's happening here, again, we'll see the same pattern emerge that we saw before with the cloud. The blob. So we've got a cloud storage account for the connection string. We'll have to go off and create that connection string for the worker role. We're using a queue client object. We're getting a reference to the queue, the hello cloud queue that now is populated with all our messages. We're getting the next message off. Now, what's really critical here is that we're not deleting the message. We're simply saying, give me the message as a consumer, and then mark it invisible so any other consumers can't access it until I tell you I'm done. And the reason is that down lower in the code, you'll see that we actually delete the message once we complete. But if we never reach that stage, say our worker role errors or something like that, the queue is actually intelligent enough to say, wow, this someone grabbed this message, but it never came back and finished the transaction. So I'm going to set, and we set the invisibility timeout when we get the message, and it'll say after this time, I'm going to bring it back up so other consumer can grab it. So it really supports that kind of high fail, durable style architecture. So then we create ourselves a message and we say, get the next message off the queue. We're ready to process it. Now, if I don't get anything back, it means there's nothing in the queue, so don't do anything, just finish off. But if I do have a message now, let's go and get the blob. So I create my blob client, I go get the container reference to hello cloud, and then I pass in the contents of my message to the get blob reference. I say, this is the reference, the URI, go and get that for me. And then I go and I change it to you have been processed. And then when I'm finished, when I've uploaded and changed that blob, I'm ready to get that message off the queue so no one else processes it. So let's go off and clean this up. Again, we need to go off and add some references in here. So let's go and do that. Storage library. And then the final thing we need to do is we need to go into our onStart event. So remember, we have to add that reader code that says, hey, if anything changes in terms of configuration settings, I need you to go and update this information with those new config settings. So if the storage connection string changed when we deploy it to the cloud, go and update that so we're getting the right reference. So let's go and add that code in there. And now let's finish off by clicking on our Hello Worker project. Again, we want multiple instances, so we have high availability, so we're going to set that to 2 instances. Let's go into our settings, add our storage connection string as we did for our web role. Connection string, use development storage, save that. Let's go ahead and build that, make sure that we have no errors, and let's go off and run that. So again, we can see down the bottom here that it's packaging the service deployment, it's running the service deployment, it's going off and deploying that. So now what we see is we see 4 nodes. And this is our 2 web roles and our 2 worker roles. But let's go have a look at what's happening inside the queue. So there you go. You can see that the worker role has actually started processing these queues. So we went from 9 to 7. And if we keep kind of refreshing that and seeing what it's doing, we start to see that they're starting to decrement or they're getting processed. And if we go into our container and start refreshing that, we'll notice that these bytes start changing. So what does a 24-byte blob look like? Anytime soon. You have been processed. So again, we can start to see that all of these have started to be processed. There's one left. Let's look in here, refresh that. There's the one message. So we're seeing a really powerful consumer-producer style pattern inside our web and worker role, all in 45 minutes. So again, thank you. Thank you very much. So let's quickly recap. What did we do? We built our web role, multiple instances. We built our worker role, multiple instances. The web role was uploading a blob, was creating a pointer in the queue. The worker role was able to consume that and process that blob. How did we do it? We create our new project, add a role, write some code, run and debug locally, deploy to the cloud, create our accounts, deploy the service, and you're running. So again, in summary, key things. It's the same development tools and experience, nothing new that you have to learn. It's a local development environment and the cloud-based environment. So you can do everything you want locally before you publish to the cloud. It's a very rapid experience. You saw what we were able to do. Very powerful scenario that we see in a lot of customer applications we're able to do in 45 minutes and taking our time as well. So other sessions to attend. I definitely encourage you to check out these sessions. Again, some great content. Windows Azure monitoring, logging, and management. How do I actually see what's happening with my worker and web roles? Windows Azure tables and queues deep dive. I really recommend heading to that one. You'll get a really good deep dive into the storage system. And again, all the rest of these are really fantastic sessions to attend as well. Really round out your knowledge. And again, please fill out, well, grab your the little handouts on your chairs. You've got the ability to either win a blue track mouse or an awesome flip camera. So I really encourage you to do that. Yeah, there should have been some on your chairs, or otherwise you can grab them from the booth, the Windows Azure Lounge booth. Unfortunately, we haven't got time for questions. However, I'm going to be down at the Windows Azure Lounge, so please come down and let's have a chat about this session. Thank you very much. Thank you.